In a car in Britain during the 1970s, it could feel a bit like a gamble. Some cars turned out to be brilliant, reliable, comfortable, and worth every penny. But others, well, let's just say they looked a lot better in the showroom than they did 6 months later. Back then, motoring wasn't always straightforward. Rust seemed to appear overnight. Electrical gremlins had a habit of showing up at the worst possible moment, and some cars developed reputations that owners never quite forgot. Now, before we start, it's worth saying that every car on this list had its fans. In fact, some people watching may have owned one and absolutely loved it. But enough drivers experienced the same frustrations that these motors became famous for all the wrong reasons. So tonight, let's take a proper trip back and look at 10 cars from the 1970s that many drivers regretted buying and see whether you agree with the list. Number 1. The Austin Allegro. We almost had to start here. The Austin Allegro has become something of a symbol for disappointing British cars. Mind you, when it first arrived in 1973, expectations were actually quite high. It was supposed to replace the popular Austin 1100 and 1300. Ranged families expected something modern, something better. Instead, many owners found themselves frustrated. Build quality wasn't always consistent. The styling divided opinion, and then there was that famous square steering wheel, a feature that left plenty of people scratching their heads. Of course, some owners still defend the Allegro today, but many drivers who bought one in the 70s felt they hadn't quite got what they were promised. Number 2. The Morris Marina. The Morris Marina sold extremely well. In fact, thousands of British families bought one. But popularity doesn't always mean satisfaction. Drivers found the handling disappointing. The suspension design felt dated even when the car was new, and compared with some rivals, it simply didn't feel particularly modern. Owners often complained that it wasn't especially exciting to drive. Not that excitement was the main priority for most family buyers. But when you're spending hard-earned money, you expect something that feels a little special. For many Marina owners, that feeling never quite arrived. Number 3. The Hillman. Avenger. Now, the Avenger started with plenty of promise. It looked smart, it offered decent space, and it drove reasonably well. The trouble was durability. Rust became a major issue for many owners. Some cars seemed to develop corrosion alarmingly quickly, especially given Britain's weather. Drivers who expected years of dependable motoring often found themselves facing welding bills far sooner than they expected, and that's never a pleasant surprise. Number 4. The Triumph Stag. Now, here's a controversial one, because the Triumph Stag looked absolutely fantastic. Even today, they're beautiful cars. Back in the 70s, owning one felt like a dream. A proper sort of motor people turned around to admire. Unfortunately, many owners soon discovered that looks weren't everything. Engine problems became notorious. Overheating issues frustrated countless drivers, and reliability concerns damaged the car's reputation. That's what made ownership so frustrating. Because the Stag had so much potential, many people loved the idea of owning one. Far fewer enjoyed dealing with the problems. Number 5. The Austin Maxi. The Austin Maxi was actually quite innovative. Plenty of space, practical hatchback design, flexible interior. On paper, it looked ideal, but many buyers complained about quality issues. Early gear changes felt awkward. Performance wasn't exactly thrilling, and some owners simply found the whole driving experience rather uninspiring. The Maxi wasn't necessarily a terrible car. Many drivers expected more than they received, and that's often where regret begins. Number 6. The Chrysler Alpine. When the Chrysler Alpine arrived, it looked impressively modern. It even won European Car of the Year. Expectations couldn't have been higher. Yet for many owners, reality proved disappointing. Reliability concerns appeared. Rust became a familiar problem. Electrical issues frustrated drivers, and despite its modern appearance, ownership sometimes became more hassle than people expected. A real shame, because the design itself was actually ahead of its time. Number 7. The Reliant Robin. Now, we couldn't make this list without mentioning the Robin. To be fair, plenty of owners absolutely adored them, that they were economical, cheap to insure, and incredibly distinctive. But let's be honest, three wheels weren't for everyone. The Robin developed a reputation, or unfairly, for unstable handling. Countless jokes followed, and many drivers who bought one hoping to save money found themselves wishing they'd stretched the budget a little further. Still, it remains one of Britain's most memorable vehicles. Number 8. The Rover SD1. Now this one probably hurts, because the Rover SD1 looked magnificent. When it launched, it genuinely seemed like the future. Stylish, modern, and packed with potential. Unfortunately, build quality issues quickly appeared. Owners reported faults that simply shouldn't have happened on a premium car. Panel gaps, electrical faults, interior trim problems. The design was excellent. The execution wasn't always quite there, which explains why so many drivers felt disappointed, despite loving the car itself. Number 9. The Vauxhall Chevette. Chevette wasn't necessarily a bad car, far from it. In fact, many people owned them quite happily. The issue was expectations. Some buyers found them a little basic, a little underpowered, and perhaps not quite as refined as some competitors. People expected a modern small car. Instead, some felt they received something that already felt slightly behind the times. Not enough to ruin ownership entirely, but enough to leave a few regrets. Number 10. The Lancia Beta. Now this one became infamous. The Lancia Beta arrived with style, comfort, and impressive engineering. Many buyers were genuinely excited. Then came the rust stories, and there were plenty of them. The car's reputation suffered enormously. Owners who expected Italian sophistication instead found themselves worrying about corrosion. Cars deteriorated far faster than anyone expected, and once a reputation like that takes hold, it's difficult to recover. Even though the Beta offered many positive qualities, rust became the story everyone remembered. Looking back now, it's easy to laugh about some of these cars. Time has a funny way of softening our opinions. Many of the vehicles on this list have actually become quite loved by enthusiasts. But if you owned one back then, things probably felt rather different. You weren't thinking about future classic car values. You just wanted a reliable motor, something that started every morning, something that got you to work without drama. And when a car failed to do that, disappointment followed quickly, especially when money was tight. Because, for most people in the 1970s, buying a car wasn't a small purchase. It was a major investment. Families saved for years. They researched carefully. They hoped they were making the right choice. And when things went wrong, the frustration was very real still. Despite all their faults, many of these cars remain strangely lovable, because they remind people of another Britain, a Britain of Sunday drives, family stations with smiling attendants, and a time when every car seemed to have its own personality, even the troublesome ones. Perhaps, especially the troublesome ones. After all, nobody tells stories about boring cars, but people still talk about these decades later, and maybe that's why they continue to hold a special place in motoring history, not because they were perfect, but because they were memorable. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Which 1970s car do you regret buying? Or perhaps you owned one of the cars on this list and completely disagree. Go on, let me know in the comments. I always enjoy reading your stories, and it's fascinating how differently people remember the same cars. And if this video brought back a few motoring memories from the old days, give it a like. It helps more people discover these stories and keeps Britain's motoring history alive. And if you enjoy these trips down memory lane, don't subscribe, that there are plenty more classic cars, forgotten stories, and nostalgic journeys still to come, because sometimes the cars we remember most aren't the best ones. They're the ones that taught us the hardest lessons. And for many drivers in the 1970s were certainly among them.